bad.
What's up, everybody? Another episode of Rip Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Varandas, also known as Ricky Varandas, and I'm back. I know it's been probably a couple weeks, a little bit of life getting in the way, a little bit of just having an issue with scheduling some guests and then schedules colliding or whatnot. But either way, I'm back with another great episode. Today we have Dr. Amir Afkhami from George Washington University. He's an author, historian, doctor, really fascinating guy, has traveled all over the world, born in Iran, spent time in France, now in the U.S., really interesting background and perspectives, and we had a really thought-provoking conversation, so hopefully you guys enjoy this. He's also friends with a recent guest, Michael Suzanne, who wrote the book Backstabbing for Beginners about the whole food for oil scandal when he was working for the UN and became a whistleblower exposing all the people who are making tons of money off this what's supposed to be UN program. So definitely check that podcast out if you haven't. But great conversation. We talk about everything from history, addiction, drugs, depression, foreign policy, and everything. And we didn't always agree, and we disagreed, and these are the conversations I love because it's so important to not just get people on you agree with all the time, but also get people who are willing, maybe unintentionally, challenge my own ideas and or unknowingly challenge my own ideas. So I think that's important because our ideas should be constantly changing and molding, and we should reevaluate and recalibrate. Calibrate? Is that even a word? Calibrate, recalibrate our ideas and opinions. So what else? If you guys are new to the podcast, or if you're a newer listener, because I haven't done one of these Fight with Friends podcasts in a long time, what they are similar to Joe Rogan's Fight Companion podcast. Every once in a while, we do these live shows where we watch a MMA event, we'll watch a pay-per-view event, and I'll get together with some friends, and we share some personal stories, we joke, we laugh, we drink. You can watch us on YouTube while I'm struggling today, while watching the UFC event, or you can listen to it afterwards and just hear what we have to say about what you watched. And they're fun, and the conversations go everywhere, and we joke, and sometimes we talk about the fight, sometimes we don't. It's very similar to kind of Rogan's Fight Companion, and I call them Fight with Friends, but I'm hoping to do one very soon, either the upcoming I think that's UFC 234, or maybe one of the upcoming events after that. But we haven't done one in quite a while. I think it's probably been 6 months, if not longer. And so I'm really looking forward to doing another one. So if you're a new listener and you're not familiar with Fight with Friends podcast, that's what that is. Follow me on Twitter, RV36, Instagram, RV36, our YouTube channel, RV36, or just look up the Ripple Effect podcast, search it, and you'll find it. And also, you can find us on Facebook. You can just look up the Ripple Effect podcast. You'll see it there. Or you can friend request me if you'd like. And Ricky Varandas. And you can keep up with when those Fight with Friends podcasts happen, because I'll send out the link and I'll give you guys a notification just letting you know that we'll be going live and we're doing one. So what else? Also, the intro music. I get a bunch of people telling me they love the intro music. It's my music project called Theory 6, which is why I have all this Theory 6 theme things in regards to my Instagram page and Twitter account and all that stuff. If you're looking for that song, you can find it on Google Play, iTunes, I believe Spotify, Amazon, anywhere you can find music, you can find it. Also on our YouTube channel, in the show description, you'll be able to see find links to, holy shit, I should redo this intro. You should find links to the music project where you can download the music, and all that money goes to supporting the podcast. So anybody who has purchased music, Theory 6 music, all that money goes to helping out the podcast. So that's it. Enjoy the show, and I will talk to you and see you guys on the next one. Peace.
This is Amir Afkhami.
Hey, Dr. Afkhami, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you, Ricky?
Good. Actually, I should have introduced myself. But
I guessed as much when I got the private call.
But thanks for being with me. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you're big into history. You've traveled all over the world with a recent guest of mine and a friend of yours, Michael Suzanne, who has an incredible story. I'm glad I had him on to share that story. It was pretty amazing when you realize all the things he's been through and all that stuff. And I love just meeting people that have traveled and experienced different cultures and different experiences that help mold their perspectives. So hopefully this conversation won't be any different.
No, definitely. I give some credit to Michael Suzanne for getting me into some of my scholarly work as a university professor in global mental health, because he actually encouraged me to go to Iraq with him back in 2007 at the height of the civil war there, because he wanted to finish the last chapter to his book, Backstabbing for Beginners. And I had a lot of contacts on the ground in Iraq. He'd been out of the UN for a while, so he didn't have the same level of contacts on the ground. So he said, "Hey, you have your contacts. You've been asked to do a lot of needs assessments under medical facilities in Iraq and a refugee situation. So why don't we go there?" And I said, "Are you kidding me? It's a war zone. It was sort of at the depth of the civil war in Iraq back in 2007." But he said, "Well, let's do it." And he encouraged me, and I ended up going there. And the subsequent report I wrote about Iraq for the State Department ended up being the basis of the Iraq Mental Health Initiative, which worked on rebuilding the capacity to deliver mental health care in Iraq between 2008 and 2010. And then obviously subsequently I went back for a couple of other projects, but I always credit Michael with being that initial push to get me involved in conflict zone mental health. I don't think I would have done it had it not been for him.
Well, people say that the best doctors are people who are active in those conflict zones, because you're constantly dealing with patients or dealing with the most extreme versions of issues, and you really get hands-on experience. So it's I'm sure what you've learned, with going to Iraq with them and dealing with that was probably something you can't really quantify. But it's do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you certainly see a different set of illnesses or pathologies than you would otherwise see. But you also learn surprising facts. In my world, trauma is really big, and typically when we think of war and conflict and trauma, we frequently think of death and sort of the direct effects of war as being the sources of that trauma. But one of the things I learned from working in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to an extent scholarly-wise, working on the drug problem in Iran, is that war in of itself, or the direct effects of armed conflict, are not as traumatic as the destruction of the social fabric itself, sort of losing your place in the community, losing all of your social networks, having to be displaced to a new area. These have a larger impact in terms of traumatic manifestations than sort of being shot at. It's interesting in this day and age when we deal with the question of refugees and population movement and the amount of trauma those individuals deal with in their migration process out of their homeland, whether they're moving from Central America to the United States or the Syrian refugees leaving and coming to Europe. We often forget that they don't necessarily have to be exposed to direct armed conflict to have those traumatic pathologies. But the fact that they've lost their homes, they've lost their social networks, they are displaced, that in of itself has a great propensity to develop traumatic symptoms. And that was one of the big lessons I took away from over the years of working in these conflict zones.
Yeah, I've had Johan Hari on, who wrote Lost Connections, uncovering the real causes of depression. And when you look at his work, when you look at people like Sebastian Junger, who wrote the book Tribe on homecoming and belonging, I mean, all these, this research, it all focuses on the fact that a lot of depression, a lot of trauma, a lot of unfulfillment comes from just a lack of community, a lack of belonging, a lack of you can even go as far as what's his name, Dr. Carl Hart, who researches addiction, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Rat Park experiment, where they had basically them drink out of water with cocaine, and they kept coming back, and then they eventually end up dying. And then I believe it was these Canadian scientists who took in consideration that the cage has become a part of the experiment, so they created this thing called Rat Park, where it had all the rats had all this room and to play and run, and they created basically its natural habitat to see if the same outcome would happen. And they didn't end up coming to the water, or they came initially and then went away and never came back. And they realized there wasn't so much the addiction or the addictive properties of the cocaine that was making the rat come back, but it was the fact that it was unhappy and it was in this cage. And I always say that we're constantly trying to find some type of happiness or satisfaction. I mean, we're constantly pursuing that. We drink things that make us feel good. We hang out people that make us feel good. We listen to music or dance that make us feel, do all these things and that make us feel good. And I think when people kind of lack that, maybe a substance can kind of fill that emptiness that they have. So it might not be so much the substance as it is the individual. And I think that's something we don't talk enough about in modern day, is the lives that most people have kind of shaped has been a lot of times unfulfilling. They work a job they don't really like, so then they end up buying some stuff that kind of fulfills them for a little bit, some material stuff that's temporarily fulfills them, and then it satisfies them, and then that goes away. So then they have to constantly buying things, and most of the time it's because of this, or they drink or smoke or take antidepressants or anti-anxiety pills. We're so heavily medicated, and a lot of times I wonder if it's a internal issue, if it's a lack of, like you said, a lack of community, a lack of doing something that you feel like you belong, you're important, people need you. I know Sebastian Junger's book Tribe, he was following people in the military in Afghanistan, and these they're in one of the most dangerous places in Afghanistan, and they couldn't wait to get home. And then when he reconnected with them after they got home, they were all depressed, and he interviewed them and talked to them, and he realized they weren't they didn't miss the action, they didn't miss the violence or the adrenaline rush. They missed being a part of this the military, being a part of this brotherhood, this community, and feeling important and feeling needed. And then now they're back at home, there's regular civilians, and they they work a job that nobody really cares that much about. Nobody, they don't have that community. So I think you really hit on a bigger issue.
Yeah, and this is something that's sort of very relevant today in international policy and diplomacy. It's the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which really had a cataclysmic effect on our relationship here in the United States with the whole region, with the Middle East. It was the vanguard in fundamentalist Islamic movements globally, but in the midst of the conversation on the revolution and its after effects, what is lost is the fact that Iran has one of the largest narcotics problems in the world. As a matter of fact, in the last 7 years alone, its number of addicts have doubled. The official reports say that the country has about 3 to 4% addiction rates. The unofficial reports place the addiction rates at as high as 10%. So that's huge. They have a huge addiction problem here. Folks don't necessarily associate a religious sort of a country led by clerics, a theocratic country is not often associated with the problem of addiction. It's frequently associated with sort of secular settings, if one can say. And the core problem or the core driver in Iran in its addiction problem, aside from its geographical location being close to Afghanistan, is really the country's social policies, or I should say the theocracy's social policies, which essentially are restrictive. Its inability to form solid multilateral relationships because of its foreign policy missteps has led to sort of ineffective cross-border collaboration to stop the flow of narcotics into the country. Some might even say that it's encouraged some of its sponsored actors in Iraq and in Lebanon, Hezbollah and Iraqi Shiite groups to use narcotics exports through Iran to fund some of their activities in Syria and in Iraq. So all of this, when you put it together, has led to a huge problem. People don't have a social outlet. The economy is spiraling down. The government's approach to controlling the drug problem has for the most part solely been focused on the criminal justice element of the issue. Iran used to have the second highest execution rates for drug offenses. So this has been the main driver of Iran's drug problem. So while everybody's sort of focused on the nuclear issue or the nuclear deal, this is a huge national security issue for Iran itself. And if it continues to grow unchecked, it will really be crippling for the government. It's really sort of a canary in the coal mine in terms of a potential for the sort of the sources of social discontent in the country.
Now, when you say narcotics, do you mean prescription drugs and black market stuff, or do they have?
It's mainly heroin historically. Although interestingly enough, in the past decade, methamphetamines have become very popular as a narcotic narcotic that's being abused in the country. Iran in the last several years has been one of the highest importers of pseudoephedrine in the world, which is basically used to make meth. So opiate-based drugs are the principal drugs of abuse there, heroin being one of the big ones, but methamphetamine and other drugs are making inroads in the country.
And what do you think is causing all this? Like you said, I know you briefly mentioned that you think there might be some financial interests kind of pushing this a little bit. But do you think that it's because the country, I mean, like we initially started talking about, like, do you think it's because there's so much infighting, or there, it's not a stable place right now, and then people are looking for some type of antidepressant, or is it something bigger than that?
An escape, actually. So sort of an escape from this. Certainly, escapism is a big part of it. There's an enormous amount of social restrictions in Iran. It's a theocracy, so young people everywhere want the same freedoms and want to be able to do the same things around the world. Want to go out, they want to date, they want to party, they want to have social outlets. That does not exist, at least on a public level, in Iran. The second issue is the economic problem. Iran, at least for the past year, has had about a 35%, up to the 35% inflation rate, double-digit inflation rates, and an enormous joblessness rate in the country, principally amongst its young adult population. So the economic problem is a huge issue, and then last but not least, it's been the regime's own drug policies, and this does matter. When the Iranian Revolution happened, the newly empowered clerical government of Iran really changed addiction from a medicalized diagnosis, from a medical diagnosis where addicts had access to treatment, whether detoxification or maintenance treatment, transformed that definition into a moral definition, meaning that if you're addicted, you're a criminal and a social misfit. So what they ended up doing was that they ended up initially incarcerating addicts in Iran, and later on would put them in camps in the 80s. And the idea was that they would put addicts into these large camps, get them to do difficult labor like demining activities on the Iran-Iraq border, and somehow they would kick the habit. But instead of kicking the habit, these folks actually learned more malignant ways of using drugs in these camps. So instead of smoking opium, for example, which was a traditional way that this narcotic was consumed in Iran for hundreds of years, people in these camps started injecting the drug. There's an old saying, where there's a will, there's a way. And so these prisoners in the camps would make little needles out of these Bic pens, those plastic Bic pens. You just hold them above a candle, you can make them sharp, and then the camp guards would bring in the drugs and sell them, and they would share these needles and they would inject the drugs. But then the Islamic Republic ended up having a huge HIV/AIDS problem and a Hep C problem as a result of it. So can you imagine you're the Islamic Republic of Iran, and now you have an HIV epidemic on your hands. This is the early 90s. So they suddenly tried to take a few steps back by tacitly supporting harm reduction programs and methadone clinics and needle exchange programs. But the problem was that despite the fact that they were supporting these programs, the genie was already let out of the bottle, so to say. And the main driver of new addicts and people getting hooked on drugs were the socioeconomic problems and the hopelessness about Iran's future, ultimately, for a lot of young people, which is why Iran has one of the highest number of child refugees in Europe, like children who are leaving Iran, which is shocking. Everybody thinks of Syrians, but Iranians are leaving their country in droves, not because the country is necessarily in the midst of war or armed conflict, but because of the level of desperation that people feel at their future prospects in that country, be it economic, political, or sort of basic social freedoms. And this has really been at the core driver of the doubling of the population of addicts in Iran in the last 7 years.
What's your opinion on actually the country I was born in, Portugal? They did, I'm sure, as you know, they in the early 2000s they decriminalized all drugs, and they had a huge HIV problem and needle problem and all that stuff, and it actually seemed to work. Do you think that it's because it's a small sample size, it's a small country, it might work there, but might not work in bigger countries, maybe like Iran? What's your opinion on decriminalizing all drugs?
The issue has to be approached on a multi-level basis. If you decriminalize drugs without addressing the social underpinnings of drug use, you're still going to have folks who are going to use the drugs in a malignant way, in a way that will basically place them outside of the country's economic and productivity system, and essentially be a burden to their community and be a burden to their fellow citizens in terms of being non-productive, in terms of potentially having medical sequelae or outgrowths as a result of addiction. So you have to approach this problem on a multi-level basis. So I'm not necessarily against decriminalization. And we have to be careful about this. There's a difference between decriminalizing and unregulating. So I'm all about regulating even drugs of abuse, and decriminalizing it. But we have to also institute social measures to make sure that we don't have the growth of new addicts in society, and that means ensuring that the country is on a right footing to economic growth, ensuring that people have a freedom to determine their future and have political freedoms and have human rights, ensuring that you have good relationships with your neighbors so that you can regulate the influx of drugs coming into your country. So if you can't regulate the drugs and you just say, okay, it's decriminalized and we're going to step away and we're not going to do anything about it, essentially you might start an epidemic of overdoses, as we've seen here with fentanyl, right? Because of the type of fentanyl that's coming. Like if tomorrow we said, okay, we're going to step away, we're not going to do anything about this, we're not going to have multilateral engagement to ensure that the drugs coming into the country are not going to kill our citizens, then you're stuck with a situation where you have a spate of overdoses. So I think that the sort of decriminalization has to be used very carefully and not to be confounded with sort of a laissez-faire system or a complete deregulation of drugs. But definitely, I think putting people in prison for drug use is not the right approach. You have to mandate treatment instead of imprisoning. So if decriminalization means mandated treatment systems instead of prison systems and executions, I absolutely support that.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how Portugal looked at it, was that they started looking at it as a medical issue and not so much a criminal issue. And I think that's probably the right way of going about it. I mean, I never really understood, the idea of throwing somebody. I mean, if you truly believe they're an addict and they have some substance abuse issues, how is throwing them in a dangerous, depressing place like prison gonna make them any better? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, you
can't beat it out of them. Basically, I think that the theory is for a lot of the non-scientific community is that somehow you can beat addiction out of people, and you really can't. It's an illness. Your brain has changed, and you have to address it like an illness. And where we are now, in terms of how we understand the science of addiction, the best way to treat this illness is to have people on maintenance treatment in a way where you reduce the harm of the substance on them. You allow them to reintegrate into their community, to hold their jobs down, to have housing, and treat any underlying cause, be it sort of untreated depression or, untreated psychosis, et cetera, that might be drivers of this substance abuse. Treat that and hope that over time they will get to a point where they can engage in sobriety, rather than saying, hey, we're going to put you in lockdown, we're going to put you in in an Iranian case, in a torturous situation, and hoping that somehow we can beat it out of you. That does not work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, even yeah.
And the one thing I want to add is that there's historic continuity in this. As you know, I just wrote a book entitled "A Modern Contagion" about the history of cholera in Iran in the 19th and 20th century, and it's interesting because the Iranian government's approach to trying to stop cholera in the 19th and 20th century was very similar to the Islamic Republic's approach in its attempts to stop its epidemic of narcotics. The government in the 19th century attempted to stop cholera from making inroads in the country from neighboring India, because at that time India and Pakistan were one country, under the British Raj, and an endemic source of cholera was India, was the Ganges Delta. The way they wanted to stop it was to institute large-scale quarantines. Okay, but it was impossible. They just did not have the infrastructure to be able to completely block their borders, and invariably cholera would make it in the country and repeatedly, almost on a bi-yearly basis, kill tens of thousands throughout the 19th century. This by 1904 was a big driver of the constitutional revolution in Iran, which led to a parliamentary system in the country. And by the 1920s, under a new dynasty, under the Pahlavi dynasty, Iran instituted a preventive approach, mainly through vaccination, which really challenges, by the way, the common notions on how cholera came to an end around the world. Typically, it's associated with, instituting sanitary measures, but the Iranian case shows that national vaccination programs actually had a huge impact in reducing the ingress of cholera, but essentially preventive approach rather than a sledgehammer approach of instituting cholera ultimately brought the disease to an end. So good public health measures. And when a country has good public health measures, if it doesn't eliminate a disease, it certainly reduces it significantly. But in the case of the Islamic Republic and the drug problem, the issue is closely tied with the fundamental pillars that the Islamic Republic has used as a justification for its rule, which is essentially that they're a country that follow Quranic moral indicators on how to deal with social issues, and it is very much those sort of moralistic signposts in how the government is treating the population and how it's treated the general population and its addict population that has become the main driver of this addiction problem. And until they leave that sort of religiously dictated approach to social sort of the social engineering in Iran, which has been going on since 1979. Until they change that system, I don't think the drug problem will go away.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with your background, we're talking a lot about Iran. You're actually from there. You were born there, right?
Correct.
And how long were you in Iran before you ended up moving to the States, or where did you go from Iran?
I have a very typical diaspora story. I left shortly after the revolution, a few years after the revolution in 1982, and my family moved to France, and we lived in France until almost the 90s, and it was around the middle of high school when I moved from France to the United States. And as I like to say, I sort of feel very much like Thomas Paine. I'm sort of American by decree, Iranian by birth, and a little bit of French by upbringing. So I have a little bit of the world in me.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to travel and experience different cultures. I'm constantly surrounding myself with people from different places of the world because I can always learn so much about other people's cultures. And the one thing that you realize is that we have much more in common than we have differences. And some of the specifics, maybe religion, maybe music is slightly different, but we all like community. We all want a safe place for our families to grow up. We like being around people. We like to laugh. We like to eat. I'm European, so we like to drink, but it's all very important to kind of realize that every tradition, every culture has beautiful things about it. I have friends from Lebanon, Estonia, from all over the world, and I actually have a lot of family also in France because in Portugal, a lot of Portuguese people, when my parents were growing up, moved to France because they just had more work and just searching for work. So, in the Paris.
Well, also Portugal went through a difficult period of dictatorship. Probably
Salazar,
your parents under Salazar. So a lot of Portuguese, not too dissimilar to the Iranian experience, left their country for a better, sort of a more pluralistic and open political systems elsewhere in Europe, particularly France, for sure.
Yeah, the Carnation Revolution, which was, a non-violent revolution, actually. And but I mean, people, it's funny because you think of Western Europe and you think they're pretty advanced and modern, but it wasn't that long ago that Portugal had a dictator, Salazar.
No, or go to Italy. I went to school in the south of France, and a lot of my classmates were Italian. In the 80s, lots of Italians were leaving Rome because of the insecurity and the kidnappings, and not, we think of, today we look at Syria, we look at Iraq with the bombs and the kidnappings and the assassinations. The same things were happening in the early 80s in Italy, where the mafia was killing judges right and left, where the Red Brigade were, they were kidnapping people for ransom. So, it wasn't too long ago where Western Europe was experiencing similar, certainly not to the same, I don't want to exaggerate their situation, but certainly similar aspects of the insecurity that you see in developing countries around the world today.
Yeah, and if you look at the history of a lot of these countries that seem unstable today, there's a lot of other outside influences to why that is. And what's your opinion on, obviously like the 1953 coup in Iran and all the, the Western intervention in politics in Iran. Do you think that a lot of their involvement caused some of the, the issues and the reason why Iran has had these periods of being unstable?
I don't think Western involvement in 53, is responsible for 79, despite, some of the more popular books that have been written recently. For starters, we see the United States and United States involvement in Iran and in the coup as some form of an anomaly. But we have to see it in the context of the Cold War and the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States were basically running proxy battles in Iran, in Latin America, in Europe, and throughout the world.
Oh, yeah.
And let's not forget, and this is often forgotten by non-historians, that Iran about a third of Iranian territory, a third to a fourth of Iran's territory was occupied by the Soviet Union and by its proxies, who had declared themselves as being independent communist entities up until 1946. So we're talking about 7 years before the 1953 coup. Soviet-supported communist insurgents had declared independent states in northern Iran, in the Kurdish region and in the Azerbaijan region. And it's only with a lot of difficulty that deserves its own story that the central government was able to push out the Red Army-supported insurgents in these regions. So for starters, the idea that the United States would stay on the sideline and do nothing would have created a vacuum that sooner or later would have been filled by the Soviet Union, because they certainly would not have stayed on the sidelines in Iran. So I think sort of on our sort of liberal sensibilities aside, we have to be a little real about the historical context of what happened in 53. Then we have to look at post 53. The movement against the Shah of Iran, okay, was not a movement that was born out of the 50s or even the 60s. Iran's government was Iran's economy was growing steadily in the 60s, certainly not to the double-digit rates that it was growing in the 70s, but for the most part, the insurgency against the Shah really starts in the late 60s. This is a decade after the 53 coup, and mainly motivated by the fact that the political system was changed by the Shah, particularly in the early 70s, from a pluralistic parliamentary system to a one-party system. Okay, so the Shah decides to create a one-party system mainly to expedite his economic goals for the country, because one of the theories is that he had cancer, he knew he was dying, so based on a lot of his interviews, he wanted to get the country to economic and social level where it would be on par with Western Europe and some of the big economies like Japan and rising economies like Korea. Well, that issue backfired because most people felt that they did not have even limited say which they had before in the political system. In addition to that, there was a huge anti-establishment movement in Iran, not too dissimilar to what was going on in Western Europe. Communist groups of various types were rife in the country. The student movement in the United States and Europe against the Shah was significant, and ironically, many of the most vociferous individuals against him were scholarship kids who were getting scholarships from the Iranian government to study abroad. But all of this to say that I don't think that the 53 coup was a significant driver of what happened in 1979. I think it's become a useful narrative for Iranians, particularly intellectual Iranians who were involved in the revolution in 1979, to not take responsibility for what happened and again blame an external factor. If America had not intervened in 1953, somehow everything would have been rosy, 79 would have not happened, and it's all it's all these external drivers that made 53 happen. I see that as a huge problem, because the inability of Iranians to take responsibility for what happened in 1979 by blaming 53 means that they will never learn their lesson in as far as what they did wrong. And I find that this is paralyzing, and this does not let sort of the national psyche evolve. In addition to that, we've been involved in this process of, at least certainly in recent history, in trying to be involved in regime change. And as you know, it's not that easy to do it. Right? You agree with me? I mean, we had so much difficulty in Iraq, we had difficulty in Syria and other places. And in the Iranian case, if there was not a baseline willingness a mass willingness to have Mossadegh leave power, tens of thousands of dollars from the United States would not have done the job. Mossadegh himself had character flaws. He had alienated a lot of his base that had allowed him to rise to power. The Shah was not opposed to oil nationalization. He was just opposed to the way Mossadegh was doing it. Mossadegh lost his religious support base. He lost some of his centrist support base. He refused to negotiate on any level. The United States, the reason why the United States became inamicable to him was his complete refusal to budge or negotiate. And that sort of, in essence, his character flaws, in addition to rising discontent with his premiership, ultimately led to the success of the American and British-supported coup in Iran. And I do not believe that it had as significant an influence in what happened in 1979 as popular media would like to portray.
Yeah, I mean, and you know much more about this than I do, and especially living there and experiencing this. I think some of the issue with outsiders like myself looking in is just I'm sure you're familiar with Operation Ajax, and CIA had
of course,
had declassified documents that prove that basically their motivation was oil, and I think when you see what happened in Nicaragua, Guatemala, all over the world, like you said, proxy wars.
Let's be careful. The motivation wasn't so much oil as it was to not have Iran go communist. Now, one can argue that the CIA misread the situation in Iran. It wasn't, and that's certainly a good academic argument to have. But the main driver was not Iranian oil, because ultimately, this was a British oil company. It was the idea that, if you look at what, the Assistant Secretary McGee and Alan Dulles, who was head of operations at the CIA, were talking about, they're constantly in deathly fears that Mossadegh, first of all, is a demagogue, and his demagoguery is going to open the doors for the rise of communists. And the issue is, did they misread the situation? Was Mossadegh's rise to power going to open the floodgates, or certainly create an opportunity for the Soviet Union, which had been in northern Iran up until 7 years earlier? The Red Army had been there. Would it have opened the floodgates for the Soviet Union to come in? I think a lot of Iranian scholars will say no. I take the position of saying I don't know, but had I been Alan Dulles and McGee and experienced firsthand the Red Army in northern Iran only 7 years earlier, I would have a more acute trepidation about a guy who's, to our eyes, is acting a little extreme, a little irrationally, as he was known in the pop press. He was known as Old Masi or Crazy Mazi. Literally, you look at the New York Times headlines, because he would he'd come to the U.S. and he would receive the Secretary of State at his bedside in New York hospital. He would faint. He would do all of these things that to the American eye seemed histrionic. And so, obviously, it fueled this idea that, oh my gosh, we're going to have an unstable guy in power in Iran who could open the floodgates to communists, whereas the Shah was a proven anti-communist. And so we have to be careful. This was not sort of a neo-colonial. And again, I think this has been misinterpreted, or there's been agendas in this issue. I don't think this was necessarily sort of a neo-colonial American expansionist effort in terms of trying to get an economic foothold in Iran. I think this was mostly the United States' fear that Iran would be yet another chip that would fall to the Soviet Union in this sort of long-running Cold War battle.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the coup in Guatemala. That the United Fruit Company was a big part of that during the Eisenhower administration, and you see a lot of times the word communism used over and over again, but sometimes it always seems like there's other motivations, and it makes you wonder how much of it is the fear of communism. But even if we tend to believe that statement that they're fighting communism, does it justify getting involved in other countries' conflicts, in other countries' politics, in other countries' influencing regime changes? And it always seems like the countries that, Saudi Arabia, of course, the perfect best example of somebody, Sharia law, the most extreme of religious countries, and we do business with them. We don't have any problem with them. Every president that's been in office will shake their hands and do business with them and support their wars in Yemen and support their conflicts all over the world. And yet, we go to other countries that seem less of an issue, have much less influence all over the world, and say that they're an issue, we need to get involved. So the intentions are always kind of blurry to me. You look at historically, you look at Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski and a lot of these guys who are the putting together the strategies or foreign policy. You look at PNAC and the Project for New American Century and all these think tanks and neocons. I mean, these people don't seem to be only influenced by ideology, but also influenced by business and financial gain and power and money. And so I think that's. I
mean, there's certainly that, but and there's definitely that is a driver. But again, I don't think America's intervention was as much influenced by financial gain as it was influenced by this sort of ideological battle. I have to add something else. I'm certainly not a proponent of intervention in the classical sense, but I do believe that we have to support our values around the world. And if we don't support our values around the world, then we create a vacuum that will invariably be filled by people who don't share our values. And the example I always like to give is supporting the labor movement in Poland, Solidarność, against the Soviet Union. We didn't invade Poland. We didn't go to war with the Soviet Union, yet we supported a movement that shared common goals and common values with us by giving them, fax machines, by giving them communication equipment. Now, should we have not intervened in Poland? Should we have not given them anything? Well, history would have taken a different turn. We might have not seen the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. Was there blowback as a result of doing that? I'm not sure. I don't think so. But we certainly did it. The problem is we often hear about the situations where there have been blowbacks, and I think a lot of times intervention or involvement or support are all sort of confounded together as one thing. So we have to define what it means. I think we have to support our values. We have to push for human rights. I do agree with you that we cannot have double standards. We can't say, it's okay to not to have, poor human rights in Saudi Arabia, but it's not okay to have it somewhere else. I think we have to be consistent, but we also have to be careful what kind of message we're sending to the streets when we're not being involved. And the best example is the 2009 Green Movement in Iran, where, President Obama did not speak in favor of Iranians involved in the Green Movement, and that was interpreted in the street as the U.S. government, the U.S. not supporting the people. And the reason folks said that was because when during the Tahrir movement against our own ally Hosni Mubarak, within 2 days, the president was on TV and speaking in support of the protesters. and against our own ally. So we have to be, we have to understand that words mean a lot, and it's not always just about sending troops on the ground or intervening in a concrete sense, but we should be pretty darn consistent in supporting our values around the world consistently. And I think one of the big drivers for that should be human rights, as you've pointed out. Should be basic human rights and basic dignity for individuals around the world.
Yeah, I guess to be the devil's advocate, to push, what our values are. I mean, I always have a issue with like feeling like I have the correct idea of what a country's values should be or what people's values should be, because my ideas are constantly changing, and that's why I love having people on like yourself who can give me different perspectives and stuff like that. And I just feel like, isn't that what Russia was trying to do? The Soviet Union was trying to do. They had a certain values. They could also justify their actions by saying, well, we're pushing our values onto other countries. But if you talk to, a good example of this is like the Amish, and I remember talking to Joan Hari about his book Lost Connections, and he wrote about this, about how at a certain age he gives, the Amish will give their young adults an opportunity to leave. And then if they don't want to come back, they don't have to come back. And the majority of them come back. And we might look at the way they live and say it's primitive. They don't. They should live differently. That they're restricted. They don't have access to entertainment and freedoms that we have. But they might be completely okay with that, and they might be content, and they might be happy, and maybe they want what their way of life is exactly what they want. So, I just think that it becomes this thing where we become the world police, going around saying, well, we don't like the way, or you should have different values. We think you should run your country like this. And then it becomes it has become endless wars of constantly trying to change things. And like you said, it's a double standard. I mean, look at Libya, because of, killing Gaddafi and being a part of that. They have open slave trades. I mean, they have auctions selling humans out in the open. I mean, the country, and a country that was one of the richest countries in Africa at the time, and now is a complete mess. But yet we're worried about Venezuela, and we're worried about the people there, and we're worried about, and it just. It seems so much like a double standard that it almost never, the intentions are never seem to be what they initially try to sell us, the war as, or the intervention as. And it just, you see it in Ukraine, you see it, where we're getting involved in an election. It just seems like we if you're friendly to American policy, and you don't necessarily have to be a good person or a bad person, but if you're friendly to American policy, we will let you stay in power. If you're not friendly to American policy, I mean, you look at during Iran and Iraq. I mean, we had no problem helping Iraq when they had conflicts with Iran, and then they became enemy later, and so it's like we pick and choose when they're enemy and when they're not. I mean,
look, there's all there are certainly cases of where we have intervened and things have turned out badly, for sure. There are cases where we haven't intervened and things have turned out badly, Syria being the main example, not intervening in time. And there are cases where we've intervened where things have turned out to be real life-saving, when we think of Yugoslavia and Albania and sort of the genocidal impulses of the Serbian regime back in the 90s, where we probably saved a whole hundreds of thousands of people from being wiped off the face of the earth. Again, intervening where we're not wanted, where there's no, where the population doesn't share our values, of course it's not called for. You shouldn't push an Amish or a Hasidic person to embrace our religion or embrace our values. That's different than using human rights as a yardstick, basic humanistic values which are shared by those individuals, and supporting those individuals within the country who are fighting for those values. Again, not talking about, going in and bombing people, but supporting individuals on the ground who are fighting for those values, people from that culture who are fighting for those values, who see those values as being central to their culture but being trampled on by their government. I think we have a responsibility to support that. And I strongly believe that.
No, I agree with you. I think that if we could some way go, but I agree with you. I definitely do. I guess my only pushback is that a lot of times when we go around the world selling the idea that that's what we're doing, a lot of times
we're not really doing
exactly.
it. Yeah, you're absolutely. I mean, a lot of times that's used for cover for other things, and I agree with you. Well, there's always nefarious ways of doing things, but putting nefariousness aside, honest support of these values, has the potential of protecting people, has the potential of improving their lives. There's a reason why everybody wants to immigrate to the United States at the end of the day. Okay, I think there's sort of basic common values of human dignity and the pursuit of happiness that no matter where you come from, you want. That's different than us telling someone how they should dress or how they should practice their religion. But saying that you should go ahead.
Sorry, but I was going to say, but isn't that an issue? Because you look at places like in the UK, in France, these empires that have dominated a lot of other different cultures and parts of the world, and then they bring their culture to South Africa, or they bring their culture to the Middle East, and force it upon people. There's a reason why they speak French and in so many different countries, and yet when the foreigners come to their country, they're like, no, you should learn French, and you should be, accept our country and our culture and stuff like that. And I think that becomes an issue too, where it's just, I think America's kind of a unique situation because it's a melting pot. It is a mixture of so many different things where, where people kind of feel like whatever your background is, you don't really come to America and feel like you're forced to have to, I guess, turn Christian or Catholic or eat Italian food or whatever it may be, because there really isn't much in regards to American culture, specifically uniquely American. There's Irish pubs around every corner. There's Italian restaurants around every corner. There's Chinese food, whatever you want. But it is this melting pot. So I think in America, like you said, it is uniquely like that. But I mean, I guess it's kind of a little bit of a joke, but I mean, it's probably one of the safest places you can go to anyways, because you're not a victim of Americans' foreign policy. There's a comedian, Barry Crimmins, who was this activist, and rest in peace, he passed away not too long ago, but he was this activist, very outspoken about American foreign policy, and people would always be like, well, if you hate America so much, why don't you move? And, why don't you leave this country? And he's like, because I don't want to be a victim of America's foreign policy. It's the safest place to be is here. And it's kind of, it's kind of a joke, but in a way it's kind of true too, because, and I think it's also becomes one of the issues because when you're in America, where we have wars going on in Afghanistan, we have wars going, things going on in Syria. We're helping drone attacks in Yemen, where we took over the government, the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We're involved in Libya. We're involved in all these conflicts.
Yeah. So this is again, we go back to the issue that it's easy to focus on the negative, but in the midst of your narrative, you say nothing about, for example, PEPFAR and the fact that the United States has saved 17 million lives in Africa. It's foreign policy. It's the U.S. The aid part of our foreign policy that saved 17 million lives in Africa since its institution during the Bush administration. So we might, again, we can always fight, and there's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of things that our foreign policy that has not succeeded on and has done wrong. But I still believe that we are not a nefarious country. We seek to do good. And I still believe that if we're willing to measure the amount of good we've done since our inception, whether it's been landing on D-Day and fighting Hitler to, any number of interventions around the world, all the way to PEPFAR today, saving 17 million lives in Africa, we have ultimately done more good than harm around the world. And we got to, I think it's easy to bash America because it's a low-hanging fruit, and it's sexier, I think, to take a good country and make it look bad. It's sort of like I wrote an article a while ago about Iran's harm reduction programs, and the article was the editor. It was for Foreign Policy. The editor had entitled it "How Iran Won the War Against Drugs," which, by the way, the article never contended. But that article was the most read article in 2013. I don't think because it was the quality of my writing or my information. It was just because that title was so provocative that you make a pariah state look good. And I think the reverse is true. It's easy to bash America. It's easy to say, okay, everything America does in the world is bad. And that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. I mean, America does a lot of good, and we should admit to that. The U.S. has saved. I mean, just one program alone, PEPFAR. One of my colleagues was the head of CDC for all the PEPFAR programs in Africa. She's an infectious disease doc. She's a pediatrician. She's an internist. She is one of the many people in the American foreign policy as larger establishment that's responsible for saving 17 million lives in the last 20 years. 17 million lives. That's about 1 million people a year. That's a big deal.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. That's a huge deal. I mean, that's fun. And I'm not saying that there's nothing good that they do, but I think that doesn't. And
that's an intervention. We've intervened. Maybe we shouldn't have been involved in Africa. By the way, the United States did not introduce HIV/AIDS to Africa. One might argue that European colonialism was sort of ultimately responsible for all but certainly it wasn't the U.S. that did it. But we went in there to help lives, save lives, because we understood that we are part of a global system. Yep. And the second we stop intervening and we stop being involved is actually when we experience blowback. And sometimes it's going to go wrong. Sometimes it's going to go right. But again, it's about the type of intervention that we do, and we have to be clear about that. It's about how we intervene, and it's about what indicators we use for our intervention. Are we going in there, as you've said, just to have an economic foothold to dictate what a country's political system is going to be? Or are we really going in there because there's a baseline, a demand by the population for human rights, for liberty, for the same sort of indicators that we want, and basic survival, humanitarian aid? And in that case, there's no question in my mind that we have a responsibility to intervene.
Well, I do agree with you, but the thing is that I don't think focusing or talking about the bad means that you're ignoring the good, because I think for example, friend of yours and a friend of the show who was just on not too long ago, Michael Suzanne, his story, the UN obviously has done some good in the world, but it doesn't mean you don't write a book and do a movie and talk about the how huge the corruption was in the food for oil program in Iraq. Sure. And it doesn't, and just because you're talking about it, or because I had him on and Michael's willing to talk about this story and how big the corruption was and all the parts involved, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't find examples of the UN doing some good, but it also doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about the bad and the corruption and that type of stuff. So no,
you shouldn't. But I think it's sort of, there's an over focus on everything that's bad, and an underemphasis of everything that's good. And it's fascinating for me. I think the irony is that this over-focus on the bad on the part of our foreign policy has given birth to the Trump administration's attitude about our foreign policy establishment. It's the reason why the State Department is disemboweled, because they can't do anything right. They don't do anything right. And I think, as whether it's me as a historian or others in there in the outside world as sort of interlocutors of or sort of folks who sort of keep the memory of what's happened, we have a responsibility to be equitable, in terms of our approach to things, and not, it's easy to focus on just one thing and sort of portray it as, through just one single lens, but we have a social responsibility to be equitable, because the impacts can be pretty drastic, as we've seen today under President Trump and his approach to the State Department and foreign policy. State Department is useless as far as they're concerned, and they've been disemboweled.
Yeah. Well, so what in regards to like something like Venezuela, which has obviously been in the news a lot lately, what's your opinion on something like that? Do you think that we should get involved? Do you think that's, or is that an example of maybe a situation where we shouldn't get involved?
Oh, situations where we shouldn't get involved? I think it's about the type of involvement. Are we gonna have boots on the ground? Are we gonna have a military intervention? Those kinds of things. I don't think unless there's going to be imminent harm to a population like genocide. I think we should stay as far away from that as possible. I'm not an expert on Venezuela, but I certainly think that the forces of democracy that are fighting to improve the life of Venezuelans deserve our support, whether that be moral support, whether that be giving Venezuelans, sending food to Venezuela and giving them aid, and ensuring that those individuals, because many of those individuals don't have access to the food and the financial backing that Maduro has, helping them financially, helping them have access to food, to be able to give food to their supporters, et cetera, so their supporters don't get starved out by the opponents. These sorts of interventions, I think, are things that we should be doing. And that's vastly different than, I think, sending boots on the ground or sort of this kind of sort of more nefarious sort of approaches to the issue.
Do you think, there's a lot of conversation about Venezuela having the biggest oil reserve in the world. Do you think that's coincidental, or do you think that's, is there a reason why we want to get involved with countries that have, the natural resource curse of having stuff other countries want, or do you think that it really is about democracy and trying to help the people of Venezuela?
Well, obviously the importance of the country goes with, there's no question that resource, trade, population, all of these count in sort of, if this was a little island with a population of 20,000 people, I don't think we'd be as involved as we are with a country with a significant, economic base and educated population base. That being said, it's not just a question of oil. I don't think oil is driving this. The fact of the matter is that again, as a non-expert on Venezuela, what we've seen since the Chavez era is a huge amount of food insecurity in Venezuela, an enormous refugee population that's moved to neighboring countries and has had negative economic impacts on with the movement on neighboring countries. Security instability, increased drug exports through Venezuela, which sort of affects our national security. So we do have real sort of concerns with what's happened to Venezuela since the Maduro government. I think I'm not glib. I'm not saying that economy doesn't have anything to do with it, but I just think economy is just one factor among many other factors in the way the United States is making its decision when it comes to Venezuela. I love reductionism. As a historian, I tell you that the nicest thing is when you can reduce, a decision or a trend in a country to one single thing, and it's attractive because it makes it much more understandable. But frequently, more often than not, what you see is the decision makings are way more complex. And I actually wrote about this in a recent article on the Carter administration's response to Iran and the fact that they didn't know that the Shah was sick. And one of his national security advisors said that we would have acted differently. Amongst the Iranian diaspora, there's an idea that the Shah was sold out by Carter because of Carter's behavior towards him and lack of support for the Shah. But when you talk to folks within the Carter administration, you realize that it wasn't really lack of support. It was a confused policy where there was a lot of infighting, between Cyrus Vance and Zbigniew Brzezinski, that people couldn't decide on one line of policy. And on top of that, they had no idea that the Shah was sick. And some of his responses and erratic behavior was really driven by his illness rather than by his indecision. So, these things are way more complex than having, it's not sort of like the 50s and the United Fruit Company suddenly saying, hey, I'm going to give, the head of the CIA a couple of $1 million to run a coup in a country where we're growing bananas. It's much more complex. And I think it's dumbing down our foreign policy apparatus if we just say that economic sort of determinants are driving everything.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think there's, that's why a lot of times when things happen in the news, I rarely have an opinion on it immediately because there's so, like you said, there's so much going on behind the scenes with strategy and deals being made and reasons, different consultants and different people having their opinions be heard on why we should do something or why we shouldn't. That a lot of times it's not till it's a historian like yourself, researching this stuff or writing about it that we learn, the true reasons on why we did something or didn't do something. So,
I'll tell you a story. When I came back from Iraq back in 2007, 2008, if you remember back then, a lot of the Shiite the militias supporting Muqtada al-Sadr were fighting Americans and killing Americans, and Muqtada al-Sadr was supported by Iran at the time. And I remember coming here to D.C. and I was in the supermarket, and I crossed paths with a prominent Iranian, which I'll go unnamed, but is frequently on TV as a commentator. And has written 2 books on diplomacy with Iran, and he literally looked at me and said, "Are the Americans planting the IEDs, killing American soldiers to provoke a war with Iran?" He sincerely believed that when he asked that question. I was flabbergasted. I was like, So you're saying that somehow there's this sort of secret military industrial infrastructure that so desperately wants war with Iran that it's killing hundreds of American soldiers, monthly with IEDs? I mean, he truly, same person truly believes a lot of other conspiratorial perspectives. Now, that's not to say that there aren't individuals within the American system at the time that wanted war with Iran. For sure there were. But were they sort of planting IEDs to try to provoke that, or were they running a policy hell-bent on making that happen? I did not see it having had boots on the ground in Iraq, But lots of people who were here in the United States, including, ladies from Code Pink, really sincerely believe that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's one of those things when you look at the things that we do know. I mean, we went to Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction that weren't there. We used the emotional. I guess we try to take advantage of how emotional the country was after September 11th by feeling like, getting the population to feel like that we had to do something. And they were so emotional that they didn't see that there was no link between September 11th and Iraq. And yet, there's tons of, I know personally tons of people who have PTSD, lost loved ones. We made a country
terrible thing,
a disaster.
For sure.
Yeah. So you look at the fact that we did all that based on what intentions? It's one of those things where we basically put young people in harm's way, and we knew there's going to be some casualties, and for what intention? So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that for me, like, I mean, I definitely have to see some evidence before, or at least see some dots that are pretty close before I can connect them and see enough of them before I realize that it's not just a coincidence, or not just a coincidence, but maybe there's a true conspiracy there. But there's a lot of stuff that seems pretty crazy that, because I mean, just the idea. Well, one thing that really got me politically motivated and politically aware of what was going on in the world was the Iraq War, because it seemed so insane to throw people in danger, to have a foreign country, the U.S., go into another country and just, blow things up, and all the stuff that was going on with going on there with just the night raids and all, and which probably much better than me actually being there, and it's just to do all that based on some lies, which is pretty, it's pretty obvious now. It's lies. I mean, I had Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was chief of staff for Colin Powell, and he's very outspoken about the Iraq War and what was going on, and all the anthrax conversations and all the stuff they used to try, this propaganda used to try to get us in there, and they knew there's going to be casualties on both sides. So it's like the idea that they wouldn't. That there's not. I almost feel like sometimes that's just the price. They knew that whatever their motivation was, if it was control of the country, if it was oil, if it was just taking out Saddam, they wasn't pure intentions, and yet they knew that there's going to be people's lives that are going to be ruined because of it. And if that's possible, then I guess it's hard not to at least entertain these other possibilities, from my perspective, because that is just as bad as anything. I mean, the idea that there's people today who have PTSD, people today who lost loved ones, people today who don't have limbs, who will never be normal and have their lives back, and all our American politicians do is go, "Oops, yeah, we messed up, my bad." Like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have went there. Yeah, we know Iraq's a mess. Yeah, we never found any weapons of mass destruction, and same propaganda was going on in England, pushing this Iraq war and all this stuff. And to me, it's I mean, it's evil's the only word that comes to mind. It's truly evil motivations. And I mean, when you look at something like that, I mean, it just, to me, it motivates me to make sure I am outspoken and we do talk about these things, and anytime we do get involved in a conflict, that we know it's for a just cause, and we know it's for the good of the people there, but it's when you
and can I add one more thing? I think we've become, I think a lot of times when we talk about intervening somewhere or on any level, we've become binary in our choices, in the sense that either we don't do anything and we just sit on the sidelines, or we go all in, boots on the ground, guns, bombs, the Iraq situation. I think there's a lot of gray in between, and PEPFAR is the best example. I think we've done a lot more to help the stability of Africa through investing in reducing the rates of AIDS and HIV there than we've ever done by supporting armed conflict or supporting individuals who are on our side of the fence when it comes to armed conflict. So, again, sort of to turn it back, it's, again, about the type of intervention that we choose to do, right? It's about, intervention does not always mean armed conflict. Does not always mean that we're going to parachute people and start killing people and bombing people. Intervention can, foreign policy, aggressive intervention can also mean stabilization through social help, through medical help, through helping people with education, through building civil society. And when you talk to folks in foreign policy in D.C., often intervention, gets confounded with, sort of becomes sort of a binary issue between armed conflict and not doing anything at all. And I believe strongly that we should stay involved in foreign policy. We should continue to have a positive impact through the kinds of interventions that I've mentioned.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. When it comes down to that type of stuff, and I think if we did more of that, I think we all, like I said, I think one thing that no matter what country you're from or what culture or background, we're all looking for just safe environments for our families to grow up in, and good schools and good hospitals and good roads and all that stuff. We kind of are looking for all the same things. And
there's also not only the issue of doing good, but we live in a globalized society, okay? When things are going wrong in a far-off place like Syria, it affects us. We ultimately have the impact of those issues. When Central America has a problem with gangs, which we have essentially created through our prison systems, throwing those, gang members, deporting the gang members back to their Central American countries is not going to be helpful, because all we're doing is exporting the problem there, which is ultimately going to affect us down the road. So we have a responsibility to really have a positive impact in all of these countries, even though it's not within our own borders, because invariably what goes on around the world does affect. We don't live in a world where we're protected by large moat or tall walls. All of these, what happens in another part of the world, can ultimately come back and affect us in very real ways. And I think that's not being articulated to the American population. We often see foreign policy as this sort of intangible, right? Something that happens over there, and we really don't need it, and we really don't need to do it, and it just has bad things happening as a result of it. Why have a State Department? Sort of this isolationist post-World War I mentality, and it does affect us. It does come back.
But I don't think it affects us enough, because, and what I mean by that is that you look at, being in all the conflicts that we're in, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, all these things that happen, most people like myself, I go to work, I take care of my kids, I do my priorities, I do this podcast, I do, whatever I do on a daily basis. And whatever conflict's going on in the world doesn't have much of effect on my daily routine. And I think what happens is that war just becomes this word that exists. Oh, we're in a war, but because we don't see it. We don't see how it's affecting, the refugees all over the world. We don't see how it's affected, people who's lost loved ones, countries that are a complete mess, like I mentioned, like Libya. It's because we don't see it, and we're not constantly talking about it. A little bit is because the military-industrial complex has a huge influence on mainstream media and what's being said and what's being reported. But because we don't see it, it's much easier to just be okay with it and not have this uproar of protest, this uproar of anger and just activism, because it's not directly affecting us, at least not directly affecting us enough where it matters. And I think
we've become immune to it also, to an extent. We've seen so much crisis, so much war in the last 2 decades that, yet another, conflict. We constantly are bombarded with it. And we've lost that empathy chip, I think, as a result of being exposed to all of this for such a long time. After working in Iraq and Afghanistan for a couple of years, I took a hiatus of sorts, and then was asked to go back to train folks in the Iraqi ministries by the State Department to respond to the expansion of ISIS in the country, particularly the gender-based violence that had resulted from it. And, going back there for me had such a huge impact after being away from it for a long time. It really, really affected me. I honestly think I had some acute traumatic response. I felt like when I was back in D.C., I was walking on a moon bounce, again, because I had been, over the years, I think between 2007 and 2010, I'd been a little desensitized. I'd been so exposed to the conflict. But then after having been away for about 4 years and going back, it really hit me hard how these conflicts affect, individuals and their lives. I mean, looking at these women, and I have 2 daughters myself, 2 little girls, and looking at, the harrowing conditions that these women had gone through really, really affected me, and really made it important for me to come back and advocate for them and try to make sure that they have the right kind of support, both psychosocially and treatment-wise. And I think, going back to 2011, there was this sort of overexposure to conflict that sort of had made me immune to what was going on around the world for a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. That could happen too, and I think you're absolutely right too. I mean, I think it was Stalin who said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, or somebody said that. I don't know who said that quote, but it's kind of true. It's like you hear these large numbers of things and you become immune to it. And, this bombing happened, this many people died. People get much more obsessed, and you see it living in America with, some cute little white girl goes missing and the whole world's watching every show covering this story because you can get emotionally invested in that one person. But when it's a large number of people, it's just a number. People become, it becomes a number. It becomes something that's not tangible. It's like a movie almost, people can't relate to it. But when you hear the stories, it's incredible. The stories change everything. And I think the little snippet on the news does not give you an individual story. The most powerful, usually testimonies. I worked in the U.S. Senate for about 8 months in 2014, and one of the things I learned was that the most sort of affecting testimonies were usually the ones that had a sort of a story associated with them rather than just a series of facts. So when people would come, either meet the representative or come and give a testimony about, let's say, cancer, if they just came and gave statistics, that would not have an impact. But when it was about how that affected the individual, the life of the individual, their families, that really changed perspective, even from the most sort of what seemed like the most sort of hardened member of Congress. So I think that, that's where storytelling is important. And in a sense, just to circle this back a little bit, that's why my friend Michael's work, Backstabbing for Beginners, who you interviewed before, his book is so compelling because it tells an individual story and how sort of something as sort of large and as seemingly sort of intangible as the Oil for Food program affected one person's life. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I love having whistleblowers on. I've had, Thomas Drake on and like you said, Michael and John Kiriakou. I mean, when you hear...
By the way, John Kiriakou, one of our alumnuses from George Washington University.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a graduate of this program.
Awesome. Yeah. Great guy. I mean, he... when you hear his story, Thomas Drake, it just how their lives were ruined, trying to do the right thing. And it's amazing. And when you hear specifically, because again, when you hear what they're exposing, that's important. But when you hear what they're exposing and then also how it ruined their lives in exposing it, and you can connect with that, it really brings it to another level and really, like you said, I think it connects with people. And that's, yeah, I mean, those are really important stories. I mean, I've had Chris Bell, who did the movie American Addict and Bigger, Stronger, Faster, and a bunch of documentaries. And one thing he always does really well in his documentaries, and I have a hard time getting my wife to sit down and watch a documentary, probably because we all have a little bit of a ADD now, because we're constantly being stimulated with our phones or whatnot. So now to sit down and actually pay attention to something for a little bit becomes harder. But Chris Bell does a great job in his documentaries, like American Addict. Not American Addict. That's Dr. Gregory A. Smith, who I had on in the past. No, he did Prescription Thugs, and you know, he shows his struggles with addiction and his family. I mean, he literally shows his family and gets really intimate with their, you know, how it affects his parents and his brothers and everybody's issues. And when you see how addiction affects the individual and how it can ruin their lives, you realize how important of a issue it is, and you really connect with it. And that's why, like you said, storytelling is so important. And that's why I think these long form conversations like podcasts, not to, I guess, toot my own horn, but it just, I think, not just myself, but anybody who does these long form conversations in a podcast is really important too, because I think you have a lot more room to expand on topics, conversations, and you get a much better idea of somebody's perspectives and ideas and opinions and their story and their background. Like you said, most of the time, and I've seen, you know, snippets of your interviews on, you know, where they're, you know, it's 5 minutes long, 4 minutes long, and you really don't have too much time to expand to the extent that you would probably like. And so I think, you know, these type of things are very important. So, you know, I'm always glad that to be able to have people on and really just not just, you know, have them on to share their ideas, but also expand on their ideas and have my own personal ideas too, also challenged and constantly, you know, this whole show has been a journey for myself, because it just, you know, I'm constantly trying to have people on that, you know, that I don't just agree with, but also people that I might disagree with, and constantly molding my opinions and perspectives. So I hope the listeners, and I get a lot of listeners who write me, and they say that's one of the things they like about the show. So, you know, I'm always excited when Michael suggested somebody like yourself who has a different background, who's traveled all over the world, and I'm like, okay, this guy can definitely bring a different perspective, you know, with his life experiences, and I think that type of stuff is super important.
Well, I'm glad you have me on.
So, yeah.
Let me ask you this. We didn't touch on a Modern Contagion, which actually it's interesting because there's aspects of it that ties into the issue of imperialism, because the subtext is imperialism and public health in Iran's age of cholera. So I presented one notion of intervention, but I didn't talk about you know, the other notion of what I call nefarious intervention, which I talk about in my book, which is, you know, there's certainly cases of nefarious intervention. I don't want it to come across like, you know, any kind of, you know, intervention is all good. What I sort of wanted to sort of emphasize is that it's a gray area. There can be good and there can be bad. And one of the clear cases of bad, in my perspective, in terms of intervention, was in the 19th century in Iran, where quarantines and sanitary intervention in Iran in the 19th century by Britain and Russia, under the guise of trying to stop global pandemic of cholera from crossing the country into Europe, became a way for the two countries to have a trade war with each other. You know, that's a clear case of a nefarious impact of intervention, where Russia was using its quarantines instead of to stop disease to really stop British, you know, commerce out of India with the world, and the Brits similarly, through their control of quarantines in the Persian Gulf, were trying to stop Russian commerce as part of sort of this greater battle that was being fought between the two countries, essentially what I call the Victorian era's Cold War between Russia and Britain, which was known as the Great Game at the time. I don't know if you've read Peter Hopkirk's famous book, The Great Game, but it was this sort of long-running, almost 7 or 8 decade conflict between Russia and Britain for dominance in Asia.
Yeah. Well, I know of the book. Yeah. And so your book, like you said, the subtitle is Imperialism and Public Health in Iran. It's so what is how you pronounce it? Cholera.
Cholera.
Well, what is it, and what causes it? What do you think caused the epidemic?
So it's fascinating. Cholera is a fecal-oral disease. Basically, fecal-oral diseases are classes of diseases where people basically get it by ingesting ingesting the germ, usually through infected water, and they defecate or body fluids, then re-enter it into the environment. Typically, fecal oral diseases like cholera are conveyed by the intermingling of sewage and drinking water. It is typically associated as it's a prototypical or exemplary disease of the 19th and 20th century, where it killed millions of people in Europe and North America and Asia. But most recently, cholera has been the biggest cause of death in Yemen during its civil war. It's a disease of war. It's a disease of bad infrastructure where you have a mixing of sewage and water. It was a disease that was endemic to the Ganges Delta, probably had been there for centuries. Something about the alkaline waters of the Ganges Delta sort of gave rise to the bacterium, the cholera, the Vibrio cholerae, or the cholera bacillus. And with the penetration of India by the British in the 18th century, and sort of the increased maritime trade and sort of relatively rapid transportation out of India, the disease was introduced to the world in the early 19th century, in the 1820s. The Brits, the British East India Company initially, and later the British government had a foothold in India. It was part of the empire later on, and a lot of trade from India via British ships went around the world. The British East India Company had a factory in southern Iran, and of course, the factory would bring in goods from India, and with the goods and with the people came cholera. Prior to the British penetration of maritime penetration of India, the disease would have probably died out before it reached the rest of the world. But because we had shipborne, the ships traveled relatively fast, the disease was able to spread to the rest of the world. And so went through Iran in the 1820s for the first time, spread to Europe and North America, and was a completely new disease that certainly Westerners and Iranians as well were relatively unfamiliar with. It was a disease that when you got it, you rapidly you had a severe diarrhea, and as a result of the diarrhea, you would have significant fluid loss and hypovolemic shock, turn blue, turn gaunt, start having seizures, and in some cases within a couple of days die. So it was sort of one of these shocking diseases. You got it. It was, suddenly went from being a sort of a strapping, sort of strong person to being a completely gaunt, blue human being, shivering and shaking, contorted and dying. It affected people of all ages, and killed relatively rapidly in large numbers. What's significant about the disease is that it's associated with the birth of the urban sanitary movement in the West. Okay? The disease was the reason why one of the reasons certainly why Paris was redesigned by Baron Haussmann. So if you ever go to Paris, you see these big boulevards, these open spaces, lots of parks. relatively good water system. These were created because it was thought that cholera traveled with bad air, restricted air. And later on, with thanks to John Snow in England, associations with water were discovered. Even before the fact that germs caused it were discovered, people still thought there's something to do with degeneration and bad air, but the associations with water were made in the 1850s. So big cities stretching from New York City to London to Paris to other big capitals in Europe started bringing clean water from outside of cities, started creating open boulevard, changing these sort of medieval alleyways to open boulevards, etc., as a means of controlling the disease. Now, in Iran, this never happened because under the absolute Qajar monarchy, there was a lot of administrative dysfunction. As I've explained, there was sort of imperial intervention in the country that arrested some of the country's ability to institute good preventive measures. But ultimately, it's the failure of the Iranian government at the time to reform the country's infrastructure and sanitary system that led to the disease continuing to ravage the country even after it was largely eliminated. Big outbreaks were largely eliminated in Europe and North America. As a result of this, as increasing number of Iranians, thanks to the telegraph, newspapers, etc., in the latter half of the 19th century, learned of the germ theory of the disease and the fact that in the West, the disease was brought under control through sanitary interventions, they became more and more unhappy with the way their government was taking care of the population, and the fact that the country was diseased and was repeatedly experiencing these outbreaks became very much part of the revolutionary narrative in Iran in 1904, 1905, especially following a huge epidemic in 1904. And the epidemic itself had a huge impact on the economy, causing double-digit inflation. So together with the unhappiness with the way the government was taking care of people and the double-digit inflation led to the Middle East's first large-scale democratic movement, Iran's constitutional revolution in 1906. This is not often known that there was a democratic movement in Iran in 1906, the first of its kind in the Islamic world, where the population started calling for a change in the absolute monarchy to a consultative parliamentary system. And a parliament was founded on this basis in Iran, which for a few years, Iran was a parliamentary monarchy. And the parliamentary system, despite the fact that Iran is a theocracy largely under the control of supreme leader, there's still a functioning parliament that has some power, legislative powers, albeit sort of subservient to the supreme leader within the country. And this tradition really starts in 1906 as a result of the response to cholera. So the idea that the disease would have such a profound impact on the political system has been something that has been missed in the historical narrative of the country.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. And your book is available on Amazon, and is that probably the best place to get it?
That is the best place to get it. I'm happy to say that it's been a number one seller on Amazon. Cholera is obviously because of what's going on in the Middle East and Yemen, and also because of what's happening in Iran around the 40th anniversary of the revolution. A lot of people are trying to find out, so what are the roots of what happened in Iran and what's going on currently in Iran, and my book tries to explain that.
That's awesome.
And it's available on Amazon, yes.
Do you have any website or anything you'd like the listeners to go to? Do you keep?
Sure. I'm one Google click away, as they say. But my website is www.Amir Afkhami, one word, so AmirAfkhami.com. So AmirAfkhami.com. That's my personal website. And of course, I'm a full-time faculty at George Washington University. So I have websites at the medical school and the School of Public Health. And I think I have something in the history department as well. So you can find me on those websites as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I have you on again in the near future. We can continue our conversation.
I would like that. I hope it was thought-provoking, and thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. Yeah, definitely thought-provoking. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and keep in touch. And I'll send you the links to the show once it's up and live. And feel free to share it and put it anywhere you would like. And like I said, hopefully we speak again in the near future.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
I believe in the ripple effect.